wanted to cover a couple of tips I've done using with SPFx over the last couple of months or so, using Visual Studio Codespaces, or I guess you could say GitHub has them as well as React hooks. So a little bit about me. I work at N365. I co-host a podcast. If you don't hear enough of my voice today, you can certainly find out more. I will say that we recorded the interview with the PM of Codespaces earlier this week, so that'll be published in the next couple of weeks. So if you want to learn more, you can certainly get it from there. I'm happy to answer questions. I'm on the Twitter and or email. Happy to follow up on any questions that you guys might have as well. So real quick, I want to show a little bit about Codespaces. I confirmed it's one word with one capital letter. So Codespaces is currently in public preview, which lets you connect to a cloud-hosted development environment using the browser or VS Code or Visual Studio. And there's the link in there. We can get these links posted up as well. They're pretty straightforward. But the idea, of course, around this is that Microsoft will then host, or GitHub, right, will host a development container, and you can connect to it using your various tools. So I want to switch first over to the web page, and here's Visual Studio Codespaces. Now I've connected using my Microsoft account that has an Azure subscription. You have to connect to an Azure subscription, and so I've done that. You can see I have no Codespaces. So I'm going to create a blank one now. So we'll call this Demo 1 for the moment. And the idea around this is that you can connect to a Git repository. I'm going to leave it blank for now just to show you what you get when you launch this. And so I'm in the browser. It's going to go through and do all this work, and then we'll eventually load Visual Studio in the browser. So you can see here, online.visualstudio.com is coming up. It's telling me it's preparing my environment, and off it goes. Well, so that's kind of interesting, but at the end of the day, I want to be able to do something, right? And so the first impression might be, this is like a VM, so I can then do Yo Team or Yo Microsoft/SharePoint if I want. However, the idea around this really is that perhaps you have a GitHub repo already, or a Azure DevOps repo that you would then connect to, and then you can work on that code. So that's kind of the scenario that I would typically do. So next I'm going to switch over to Visual Studio Code, and I have an empty window in Visual Studio Code here, and I've installed the extension called Remote Explorer, and this connects again to the same Codespaces. Let me just do a quick refresh here. And so I'm going to create a new Codespace. However, this time I'm going to connect to a repo that I already have. And this repo has just an out-of-the-box 1.10 SharePoint web part or SPFx web part already created to it. And so the idea here, of course, now is I would want to work on this web part, or perhaps I need to review a PR, or perhaps I just need to make a quick change, or even if I want to do my full development, I don't have it locally. So this will go through and do the same thing. Now, what if I go back to the browser one? You can see here it's done all its work. It's created. I can do the terminal. And if I look here and I do Node, you'll notice that what I get out of the box is that version 12 of Node.js, which is not what SharePoint is built on at the moment. However, Node Version Manager is installed on the VM, so I can do the information, right, to switch over to version 10. So now what I've done in this SPFx Codespaces repo, so let me switch over to that real quick. That would be here. I've created what they call a dev container folder. And in this dev container folder, I have a JSON file that describes the environment. And this is a couple of things that we'll cover these. But the first one I'll talk about is it's doing the Spf X Setup. And so if I go back to this container and look at this script, what will happen is after my environment is created, it'll launch Node Version Manager, install version 10. And since I've reinstalled Node for all practical purposes, I'm going to need gulp. So it'll do an npm install gulp globally under Node version 10, and then it'll run npm install against the project in the current directory. And if I look in here, you'll see here that it's done the work, it's gone through. Part of what Codespaces does is it will do a clone. So if I look here, so you can see it's done a git clone of the repo that I provided to it. And then further down here, now you won't see this because it scrolls, but if you look, what's happening here in the lines, you'll see that it has actually done downloading and installing Node version 10. And further down, it is actually doing the Node or the npm install for gulp. I'm going to then connect, and now you see the window refreshes, and now in my Codespaces list here on the side, it will show, once it's connected, it will show the project. Now it looks like it's building it again, but it's really not. It's just doing a different connection. But here we are. We now have our SPF project. If I open this up here, I can do my gulp build, right? So that should work. Everything is fine. If I go back to my dev container file, part of what I've done here is I've configured forwarding ports. These are the ports that are used for the local workbench. And if I go back to my extension here, you can see here those ports have been forwarded. Now I can do these manually. I can right click and create a new one. But the idea of using a dev container file is that I can have these pre-configured and let that work, right? So if I were to run this now, I'm going to get the problem because the developer certificate is not trusted. So there's a step I have to do here. First of all, I'm going to create the dev cert. And when I run this now in this remote environment, I'm running under Linux, and it tells you so for Windows or Mac OS, it'll automatically trust that, but for Linux, it will not. So the file was created here in this folder, right? So I want to get that locally, because if I run the browser, I have to run the browser locally because I'm connected to a container that has just the Linux, shell running on it. So first of all, I'm going to do is I'm going to copy this. Oops. My shortcut is a little off here. So it's /home. Yes, online. So now I've copied that folder from where Git the trust dev cert does, and here is the certificate files right here, right? And so I can right click on this and download. Visual Studio knows that I am connected remotely, so it'll let me do this. So I just put this in my research folder here real quick and give it a name. And if I switch over to that folder, and you'll see there it is here. Now, the next step is to actually install this locally on my machine. And so the command that would be run by the gulp task is the cert util on Windows. Oops, I forgot to do this. And so now I get my typical, you're about to install the certificate. Yes. Now that I've done that, I can view this in the workbench. So to do that, gulp serve. If I put these in my notepad so I can paste them here. Well, that'll run, and gulp serve then, of course, will run, start the workbench for me. And so let me open the browser real quick. Now, I haven't seen that the redirects don't normally work so great, so I just put in the workbench URL. And now you see, boom, there we are with the workbench, and we have our wonderful Hello World web part, life is good. So these steps are summarized on my blog. I'll post that link in the when we're done. But that's the idea around Codespaces, is that I can connect quickly, get a SharePoint framework or any environment running. Now, right now it's only Linux, and Windows is on the way. And again, Visual Studio, full Visual Studio for the 6 or 8 of us who still use it, is in private preview, but that's available as well.